We've got the pleasure of starting a new part of our study here in the auditorium. Remember, the class is supposed to cover the books of Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. So this morning we're going to start the book of Ruth in the Old Testament. But before we really dive in, let's bow, if you would, in a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we thank you so much for another opportunity like this to be able to come together with your people, to be able to open up your word, to be able to proclaim your name. And we thank you so much for these times. We ask that this morning we make the most of it, that we can look at this introduction to the book of Ruth, that we can glean from it the things that you would have us to take, to ultimately know that you're in control, you're in charge of all things, and that we, even in our best of times, are still in need of a Redeemer, someone to make up or take up the calls for us and to bring us into a right relationship with you. We thank you so much for this story and what it represents. We ask that it can produce a change in us to live better lives for your service, for those around us, and to ultimately be a light to the Gentiles. We thank you so much for all of your blessings, especially the ultimate culmination of this story, which is your Son, Jesus Christ. In his name we pray. Amen. All right, so like I said, we've been covering the time period of the Judges most recently, wrapping that up on Wednesday, and that was characterized by a pretty overall dark period of time, right? It was 21 chapters of bad on bad on bad almost, so we've kind of got a little bit of a reprieve now moving into this study of Ruth. So we're in our 24th class, and like I said, we're starting the book of Ruth. We've got 4 classes to cover the book of Ruth. I'm excited to do that, not least of which because this is the first time I've ever actually taught the book of Ruth, and we've got 4 classes to cover it. You can cut Ruth any number of different ways. That's not a joke to the end of Judges, but you could spend several classes. I've heard some people say that you could take the book of Ruth and make it an entire trimester out of it. I probably couldn't do that. Better men than me could. But I could probably maybe make 10 or so classes out of it at the most. But we've got 4 classes. So what we're gonna break this out, at least that's how I'm kind of envisioning, is today we'll do something like an introduction and kind of introduce some of the primary themes and some of the like a general overview of the book. And then on Wednesday, Jay will cover chapters 1 and 2. And then the following Sunday, next Sunday, a week from today, we'll do chapters 3 and 4. And then we'll conclude with looking into a little bit deeper dive, some of these themes that are brought out in the book of Ruth. So we'll cover this introduction today. And please feel free to comment and provide feedback as you want, because this could be a quick class. I'm not exactly sure. I was talking with Sydney before. I was like, I might be done in 15 minutes. I don't know. I could cruise through this, but so we'll see. Ruth is an interesting story. It's a relatively simple story on its surface. It's just 4 chapters long, like I mentioned. It's very easy to follow, very easy to read and to understand. But while it is simple on the surface, there's a lot of underlying, pretty deep theological themes, and we'll pull out those, I'm sure, as we actually study, but then definitely in our last class. Interestingly enough, Ruth is the only Old Testament book that is named after a non-Israelite. There's only one other in the whole book, or in the whole Bible. Do you know who that is? Non-Israelite? A little trivia for you on this Sunday morning. Oh, true. Okay. Touche. 2 more. All right, never mind. This is a bad example. Yeah, all right. Yeah, okay. Scratch that point. I was thinking of Luke, but you got me there. There's just one random thought creeps into my mind. Never listen to it. But you're thinking of Esther. I think is where God isn't mentioned specifically by name. God is. We'll talk about this in just a second. But interestingly enough, God isn't listed as an active actor, I guess, in the story, only twice in the book, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. The structure is pretty interesting. It's overall, I think it's like if you take the verse by verse or word by word breakdown, 50% of the book is dialogue. A little bit over 50% of the book is dialogue. So it's really portrayed like a short story, and you get to see a lot of character development. There's three primary characters in the book. You've got Ruth herself, who, interestingly enough, even though the book is named after her, she probably plays one of the more minor roles in the actual story. Then you've got her mother-in-law, Naomi, and then their ultimate redeemer and kinsman, Boaz. Those are the three main characters, and each of them have a lot of positive qualities, positive aspects to them, and are a good character study in and of themselves, people that are worthy of emulation. And that's a very interesting thing by contrast, is coming out of the book of Judges, where it's almost the exact opposite, where you read these stories of these people, even the leaders of Israel at the time, and really the overwhelming theme is, here's how not to do things, here's how not to behave, how not to act, how not to carry yourself. And then in the book of Ruth, you've got all these people who are quite the opposite, and they're doing things for other people, and we'll start to see how that plays out. Some background for the story and the study that we'll be looking at. Ruth is set in the time period of the Judges. So chronologically speaking, this is just in the same time period that we were just looking at. And if you recall, when we concluded our study in the book of Judges, the last 5 chapters are kind of something like an appendix to what's going on during this time period. And I think it was Paul actually last week on Sunday said, I wonder what's happening with Joe Israelite, during this time period, because a lot of the book is dedicated to the cycles and the actual stories of the judges, the leaders that God would raise up to save the people. But what's happening with the everyday Israelite? Well, these last 3 stories, including the book of Ruth, kind of tell what's happening with Joe Israelite, what's going on. So 2 of the 3 stories, which we covered in the book of Judges, the story of Micah and his false, profane Judaism that he set up, and then kind of working in the Levites to make that happen. Then you've got the story of the Levite and his concubine and the civil war that breaks out. And so you see what's happening, and you have a lot of unnamed characters right in that. So they're kind of representatives of the entire populace of Israel at this time period. But here in Ruth, you've got almost every primary character is given a name. So you kind of see, okay, this is maybe a small subset of what is going on in Israel. But the point being, God's not gone, right? And his true, remnant of people that are putting their faith and their trust in him and are keeping the commands, obeying the law, they're still around. So it definitely has this link with the book of Judges, not only from a chronological standpoint, but also specifically with those 3 stories right at the end. And they all start with this kind of common phrase, a certain man of Bethlehem. All 3 of those stories have to deal with Bethlehem. All right, this one starts off right in the very first verse. We're introduced to Elimelech, and he is a certain man from Bethlehem. So here's a story of a guy and his family. And then back in Micah, when it says that the Levite is wandering, he's a certain Levite coming up from Bethlehem in Judah. And then in Judges 19, you have the Levite who is just a certain Levite, and this one actually goes down to Bethlehem, remember, to get his wife, to get his concubine there. So all of them have this link with Bethlehem, so it's interesting to see how that plays out. Like I said, we are introduced to this guy whose name is Elimelech. Does that name sound familiar? Any other name that we've studied recently? Yeah, Abimelech, right? Abimelech, who was the son of who? Does anybody remember? Gideon, yeah, he was the son of Gideon. Does anybody remember what his name means? I don't remember if we talked about that specifically. What did everybody want Gideon to be towards the end of his story? Yeah, we want you to be set up as king. And he said, no, I'm not gonna do it. My sons aren't gonna do it. God is supposed to be your king. But Abimelech comes along, and what does he do for himself? He makes himself a king, right? He takes it upon himself to be a king. Actually, his name, means my father is king. Interestingly enough, kind of pointing back to Gideon, my father is king. Because if you break down that Hebrew word, Abba, we know what Abba means, father. My father is king. So Elimelech, my father is king. So if we take that same breaking down, you see the Elimelech part of his name, so is king. So what is the first part of Elimelech's word or name? El. Anybody know what El means in Hebrew? Yeah, God. It's a generic term for God, El, Elohim. So Elimelech's name means God is king. Now you kind of see just when we're introduced to him, and we'll talk more about this, I think, on Wednesday, but he doesn't seem to really live up to the standard of his name and some of the actions that he might carry out. And actually there's some Hebrew scholars that think it's kind of a play on words, actually, where he's like, I'm king, or I ought to be king in place of God in his own life. But looking back to the period of Judges, even kind of with that thought process in mind of Elimelech and Abimelech, what was the overwhelming thought process during the days of the Judges? We talked about this. It was mentioned 4 times at the end of the book in the appendix. Yeah, every man did what was right in his own eyes. Everybody's looking out for number one. You know, the judges acted this way. The people at large acted this way. We talked about in the Song of Deborah in Judges chapter 5 how the certain tribes were looking out for their own best interest and not going up to battle at different times. But everyone is doing what's right in their own eyes, and we talked about how that kind of plays out in the start of each of the cycle, where it talks about, again, Israel did evil in the eyes of the Lord. So everybody's kind of looking out for number one, doing what's right in your own eyes. And we start off the story of Ruth, where maybe it seems like we're just going to be introduced to more of the same, right? Because the story starts the same way. A certain man of Bethlehem. There's a famine going on in the land, and we'll talk about what that famine might represent. But he decides to try to escape and get out, and he goes into the land of a foreign people. He goes into the land of Moab. So you're almost, after Judges and you start this new book, Ruth, you're thinking, okay, finally, something a little different. And then it starts off and you're like, oh man, not again. We're starting the exact same way. But when you get into the story of Ruth, everyone seems to be looking out for the best interest of other people. Everyone is kind of acting and doing things that are in the best interest of the people around them, of their family, of their community. And so that's in a direct contrast to what we studied in the book of Judges, where everybody's looking out for number one. Everybody's trying to do what seems right in their own eyes. But here everybody's doing what's best for someone else. The period of Judges was characterized with a lot of harshness. That I'll deal with everybody how I see fit. If I have to ignore someone else, I'll do that. If I have to step on someone else, I'll do that. If I have to step over someone, I'll do that. Whatever is in my best interest or most convenient for me. But then in Ruth, you had this overwhelming generosity being poured out on by the different characters on the other characters. Judges, we also talked about how there was a significant lack of hospitality, most explicitly in that last story, starting in chapter 19. When the Levite and his concubine come to Gibeah, they're not treated quite well, right, on a number of different fronts. But when they immediately go into the city, no one invites them into their home. That's in a breach of custom for the to the social fabric of the day. That was not done. And then not to mention how things turned out the rest of that evening. But here in Ruth, you've got compassion. Everywhere people go, people are taking compassion on different people and entering into to dialogue with them for their ultimate betterment. But these people are ultimately dealing better with each other. The overall story of Ruth, and I've got, this is going to be a really brief version of it, but Ruth is set up in what's called a chiastic structure. Does anybody know what that means? It's a literary device. It's used very frequently in the Bible, specifically in the Old Testament, sometimes down to even within a verse. It's broken out this way. But a chiastic structure is when you've kind of got this building up on different points to a culmination or a turning point in a story, and then it kind of rewinds itself. But each point kind of linking to the one next in the story. And I've got this broken out. The book of Ruth is written this way very, very specifically and very detailed, almost down to a verse-by-verse level. And I've printed these off, and they're back in the back. We'll kind of look at one, how it's laid out overall in a more summarized format. But please pick one of those up. I think it's a very interesting study to look at the book this way and actually see the culmination point and that turning point in the story of Ruth. But it starts off in chapter 1, at the very beginning, is giving a family history. We're introduced to this family who's from Bethlehem and Judah, and Elimelech and his wife and their sons, and they're going off to Moab. But when they go off to Moab, Naomi and Ruth, we're introduced to Ruth there. Ruth was one of the wives that Elimelech's sons married. But when they go to Moab, all the men die. All right, everybody experiences this massive loss in their family. These women are left alone. Naomi tries to tell her new daughter-in-laws to go back home, go back to their own families, go back to their own land, go back to their own gods, because she's too old to have another son, right? That she says, even if I could conceive tonight, what are you going to wait around until they grow up and you can actually marry them? This is not realistic. You can't do that. So they concoct this plan to head off, or Orpah, which is one of the other daughters, decides to go off and listen to Naomi and go back home, but Ruth clings to her and decides to stay with her, says that she'll never leave her, so they kind of enter into this covenant-type relationship with one another. But they decide to go back to Bethlehem, and then when they get there, they try to figure out how are we going to feed ourselves? How are we going to take care of ourselves? Actually, sorry, this point C here. Whenever they come back to Jerusalem or to Bethlehem originally, Naomi's questioned by the people when she gets there. Everybody's happy to see Ruth and Naomi come back into town. They're excited to. Apparently, they stayed behind during this time period of the famine. Maybe just Elimelech and his family were one of the few that actually did leave. But when they come back, everybody's excited to see Naomi, and Naomi's well, don't be excited to see me. Don't even call me Naomi. Naomi means pleasant or sweetness. Her name means pleasant or sweetness, and she says, "Call me Mara. Call me bitter, because the Lord has dealt harshly with me." So she's questioned by the people of Bethlehem when they get there, and she says she's bitter now. She doesn't even want to be referred to by her old name, Pleasant. So then Ruth and Naomi have to figure out a way to fend for themselves. How are we going to actually put food on the table? Because now they're just two lone widows in the land, nobody to take care of them. How are they supposed to live? How are they supposed to even put food on the table? So Ruth comes up with this plan: just let me go out into the fields and start to work hard and try to come up with something for us. And that's where the turning part of the story actually occurs. This point E, they finally meet Boaz, who just happens to be this kinsman redeemer of the family. And Boaz, his name means strength. So right, he's the cornerstone on which the story turns. So now we're at this crux of the story when they meet Boaz, and then you kind of start to see the story rewind on itself. But each of these points kind of go back to one another. So Naomi decides to come up with this plan for her to marry Boaz, right? And so they meet Boaz in the barley field. It's the time of harvest, but they come up with this plan to get Boaz to marry Ruth on the threshing floor. Then the elders of Bethlehem ultimately witness the redemption of Ruth and the marriage of Boaz and Ruth together. They get married and they have a son, Obed, and that's said to be a son now of Naomi. And then finally it closes with the family history of David. So how this story plays into the lineage ultimately of David. So you see how this is structured up to a crux, to a turning point, and then it kind of rewinds on itself. So you've got Ruth and Naomi coming up with this plan for food that's likened to Naomi and Ruth coming up with this plan to marry Boaz. And then when Naomi comes into town originally to Bethlehem, she's bitter, she's questioned by the people, and now the people here in Bethlehem are witnessing Ruth's redemption. And they're now called blessed because of what's happened. When Naomi and Ruth's husbands die in the land of Moab, and Naomi said to be too old to have a son, you've got Ruth getting to remarry a much better man in Boaz, and now a son is born to Naomi. She was supposed to be too old to now have a son to continue their line, but now she gets to have one again. And then ultimately, like I said, we're introduced to this family history at the beginning of the book, these men who all end up dying, and we're closed with a list of men who end up bringing the salvation of Israel and Judah about. So you see how that kind of builds on itself. But the story, even more than just what we've shown here, is a lot more detailed in this chiastic structure. So I'd encourage you to pick one of those papers up. Like I said, I've got those back there in those chairs by the desk to see how that's broken out. One of the other interesting things, I know a lot of you know I'm into this kind of study, but Ruth is big into Pentecost. The story of Ruth in a lot of Jewish circles is customarily read during this period of Pentecost, or the Feast of Weeks, or Shavuot, the Hebrew pronunciation. And why would that be? Based on what you know about the story of Ruth, why would they try to incorporate the reading of this story during this time period of Pentecost from a Jewish perspective? What are they supposed to do? Do what? Yeah. Yep. Yep. Yeah, no, that's definitely one of the connections. She said that because of Ruth's connection with King David. Actually, from a Jewish traditional perspective, David is both born on and dies on Pentecost. It's kind of an interesting tidbit there. But when is the story of Ruth said to take place? When they come back into the land, when they leave Moab and return back to Bethlehem at the end of chapter 1, when is this? Yeah, right at the beginning of the barley harvest, right? And so that's kind of what the Feast of Weeks was about, the first kind of ingathering of that barley harvest. The actual commands around the feast itself, Pentecost, actually all of the main 7 feasts from a Hebrew religious perspective are listed in Leviticus chapter 23, but Pentecost specifically in verses 15 through 22. Do you remember when it's supposed to take place? How, technically I guess it's the 4th feast from a Hebrew perspective, but it takes place how long after Passover? There's 3 main feasts in Judaism. The others are kind of linked around it, but you've got Passover, you've got Pentecost, and Atonement. Those are kind of the three big ones. So how long after Passover? Yeah, 50 days, right? That's in the name, the Greek name Pentecost. It's 7. They're supposed to count 7 weeks after the Sabbath from Passover, and then the next day after the Sabbath. So that's 50 days. That's when they're supposed to take notice of this feast. Traditionally speaking, from a Jewish perspective, the Feast of Pentecost is attributed or likened with the giving of the law at Mount Sinai. And if you go back even to the period of the Exodus, whenever the Israelites come to Sinai, and you kind of even count that out whenever it says they arrive at Sinai, and then you kind of count out those 7 weeks, 50 days, that would kind of correspond to when Moses came back down from the mountain. And when he comes back down from the mountain, he's got the law, and he's giving this law, and the people are entering into this covenant relationship with God for the first time officially as a nation, as a people. So it kind of is, kind of tied in with the giving of the law and the establishment of a covenantal relationship with God and Israel. So you've got the people's kind of official conversion to Yahwehism, to the servitude or service to the one true God. And then here in the book of Ruth, you've got her conversion, if you will, to the serving of Yahweh as well, where she says, when she's talking to Naomi, your God will be my God, your people my people. And so you're going to see that the conversion aspect of it being played out here. Now, from a Christian perspective, what do we think of when we think of Pentecost? Yeah, the birthday of the church, right? And the giving out of the Holy Spirit, right? Christ said that you guys hang around, stay back here in Jerusalem because there's going to be a helper, a servant that's going to come in place of me. So you've kind of got, by contrast, at Sinai, from a Jewish perspective, you've got the giving of the law at Mount Sinai. And then on Pentecost with the church, you've got the giving out of the Spirit. So there's law versus kind of a spirit motif, if you will. You've got the people at Sinai entering into this covenant relationship with God and being really made an official people for God. And now you've got the birthday of the church in Acts chapter 2 at Pentecost. There's actually some other interesting connections. I've talked about this in some other classes, but at Sinai, how was God's presence manifested? Yeah, fire, smoke, thunder, lightning, right? And then the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, what happens when they're all together in the room? Yeah, there's this big wind, right, that comes down, and then the Spirit just shows up on the people like tongues of fire, right? So you've got God's presence manifested in fire on the people here. They get to see that, to partake of it. Again, you've got the giving of the law versus the giving of the Spirit. And then interestingly enough, back at Sinai, whenever Moses comes down with the tablets to give them the law, what's the first thing he finds? when they're entering this brand new covenant relationship with God. Everything's supposed to be rosy. It's this marriage ceremony of sorts. Moses comes down. What's going on? Yeah, they've made these idols. They're worshiping idols. They're having this massive orgy party going on down at the base of the mountain, and nobody's happy. Moses is not happy. God is not happy about what's going on. And so what's Moses and God's answer to that? Moses calls on some people. What do? Yeah, he says, he goes to the Levite, right? So he goes to his kinsmen specifically, and he says, you guys put on your swords, and we're going to go throughout the camp. And what do? Shake everybody's hand. They kill all these people that were associated with this event. How many people did they kill? 3,000 specifically. All right? Fast forward, Acts chapter 2, day of Pentecost. Peter gives this sermon, and everybody starts getting together, and how many people are saved? 3,000, right? So you've kind of got these connections kind of linking the two together. And again, this is all played out specifically within, or this is a story that's definitely elaborated, I think, in the story of Ruth specifically, in this law versus grace or versus the spirit mentality, and how you see these people acting even beyond the terms of what the law called them to do, but how God ultimately rewards them for that. And then in Leviticus chapter 23, verse 22, which is the end of the instructions around Pentecost, you've got this last verse in verse 22 where it says, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not wholly reap the corners of your field when you reap, nor shall you gather any of the gleaning from the harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. I am the Lord your God. All right, and obviously it's going to play in pretty significantly to the book of Ruth, because that's how Ruth starts to try to make a living when she comes into the land, is by taking advantage of this part of the law that would allow her to, as a foreigner, as a stranger, as a poor person, a widow, to be able to still make a living off the land, off the generosity of other people. And the concept, and we might talk about this when we get into the study of chapter 2 specifically, but when they're out harvesting in the barley fields, what are they using? A John Deere tractor, combine? Right, how are they cutting down the stalks? Yeah, sickle. How do you use that thing? You swing it, right? And do you swing in a square motion? Right? No, you swing it in a circular motion, right? So if you're swinging it like this and kind of making this arc, you're going to leave corners, right? And so the whole point of God's command here was, don't go out of your way to make sure you can get everything that's yours. If you're sitting there making sure you get all those little corners that you miss when you're swinging that arc, if you're going out of your way to make sure you're getting what's yours by rights, then you're not helping the people that really need it. So, it's do what you need to do to get the job done, but don't go out of your way to make sure you get what's yours. When you reap the harvest, make sure you're thinking about these other people. Some of the primary themes that we'll cover in Ruth, one of the overarching themes that starts kind of the study of the book has this emptiness to fullness motif. It starts off with Naomi talking to the people when she comes back into Bethlehem. She says, I went out full in chapter 1, verse 21. I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home again empty. So she's kind of putting this on God and what's happened to her. But she's saying, I went out full. I left this land full, even though she left during a famine. But she went out full. Everything was great. Everything was hunky-dory. Now I've come back empty. All right, and it ends in chapter 4, verse 14, where the women of Bethlehem again are talking to her, and they say to her, blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a close relative, and may his name be famous in Israel. That's the son's name. May he be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you is better to you than 7 sons has borne him. All right, so she went out, she said full, but she comes back empty. But now we're closing the story with her being truly blessed. And right, the people even acknowledge that, hey, those 2 sons you had, yeah, they were fine and okay, but now you've got this daughter-in-law who's truly better or better to you than having 7 sons. Right, that complete number. She's better to you than that could have ever been. So now you're truly blessed. So this emptiness to fullness understanding. From a kind of typology type review, you've got this idea of the need for a redeemer. Right? Boaz is definitely painted throughout the story, and we'll talk about this as we go along. He's painted like a Christ-like figure who just gives and gives and then gives a little bit more after that. But he is this one who is related to them, but is able to step in and redeem Ruth. And you also have a kind of an interesting study about Ruth being a Moabite, her being outside of Israel, right, from an ethnical standpoint. So you've got the inclusion of the Gentiles coming into the family of God here. It starts off with this famine in the land in chapter 1, so it's almost like God is chastising his people, and there's this punishment that's coming on them. Then this family of Elimelech tries to get away from that, right? Tries to kind of I'll pass on your chastisement of me and just go off and do my own thing. But then you've also got at the end of the story, the unnamed other relative, and we'll talk more about these details as we go throughout our study. But he has the opportunity to redeem Naomi and her property and ultimately marry Ruth, and he passes on it. Like, no thanks, I think that would mess up my own inheritance. And I think you kind of see these allusions to what Paul talks about in Romans chapters 9 through 11 about, Israel's disobedience and Israel's being punished and chastised, but they're ultimately passing on the Christ that was offered to them. And because they passed on it, the Gentiles got to be included, right? A wild olive branch has been grafted into the family, and how great that is. But how much better is it when Israel does truly accept it and they are grafted back in? The natural branch comes back into the picture. So you've got the ultimate theme, I think, of the book being the lineage of David and how that comes about. And I think based on the time that this book would have been written, one of the probably primary purposes of it is something like an apology of David's lineage, like how he got to be king and why that's important and why that's blessed by God. The David, his lineage is legitimate, it is good. But ultimately for us as Christians, we can see beyond that and see that ultimately David and Ruth, by extension, are part of the family line of Christ. Right? And so we see how that plays out in the story as well. God's acting in the book is pretty interesting because, like was mentioned earlier, the narrator only directly says God is involved 2 times during the book. The people talk about God and use the covenant name of Yahweh, use the capital, all capitals, Lord throughout the book, in referring to God and worship of Him. But the narrator only specifically says He's doing things 2 times. There's one in chapter 1, verse 6, where it says that the Lord visited His people back in Bethlehem, back in Judah, by giving them bread, by giving them food. So I think by inference you could say, well, that the famine that was on the land was also from God as a type of punishment. This is talked about back in Leviticus chapter 26 and Deuteronomy chapter 28. But up until this point in time, when we're reading the book of Judges, the punishment that God doles out on His people is mainly by other nations, right? They're going after these other gods, they're going after these other peoples, and so God brings a rival nation to come in and oppress them. But now here we see in the book of Judges, or Ruth, that God is using, natural events to kind of punish His people as well. And those are referred to in Leviticus and Deuteronomy that, if you disobey my commands and you go off with these other people and you go off with these other gods, then I'll make your land not able to yield its fruit. I'll make I can't remember how it says it, but I think it's the skies like iron and the ground like bronze, or vice versa. I don't remember, but that you won't be able to sustain yourselves in this land that I was giving you as this gift, this land flowing with milk and honey. He also talks about how He'll cause wasting diseases and sicknesses to come throughout the land to afflict the people as well. And the 2 sons of Elimelech, Mahlon and Chilion, their names, and don't name your kids that, because it basically means like sickness and wasting away or death. Like those are what their names mean. And sure enough, when they go off to Moab, they die. So likely they were maybe like sickly children or something, but I don't know if I'd still name my kids that even if they were sick. But you kind of see how that's played out, and it's this omen that's coming on the people. But clearly there's been some type of reluctance to truly and wholeheartedly serve God, so these punishments are coming on the land. But the only other specific reference to God acting is in chapter 4, verse 13, where it says the Lord enables Ruth to conceive and her to bear the son Obed. And that'll come into play, I think, in just a second if we have a chance to get to it. Other than that, you kind of see, kind of like with Esther, you've got God moving out through the scene via His invisible touch, just kind of moving things along. there's these chance encounters all throughout the book. And I've got chance there in quotation marks, because when you read the story between the lines, you realize it's not just random. It doesn't just happen that way just because. In chapter 2, verse 3, whenever they come back into land, you have Ruth deciding to go work in the fields, and the text even says this, that she just happens to go to the field of Boaz, who was a kinsman redeemer. She was related and had the ability to redeem her and her family. So it's almost the text, another literal translation of it could be, as luck would have it, that she just happened to go to that place on that day. The very next verse says, behold. And anytime you see behold, especially in the Old Testament, from a Hebrew perspective, it's supposed to be like a surprise. Like nobody expected that to happen. So she shows up at this field to work. She just happened to pick this one. And behold, it just happens to be the day that Boaz is coming to check on what's going on in his field. All right. And then at the end of the book, in chapter 4, after Boaz has decided to try to redeem Ruth, there's someone else in the line above him that had rights to it first. He goes to the city gates of Bethlehem with the elders, and again it says, behold, surprise, that guy who was next in or first in line just happens to show up on the day that Boaz was going there to try to take care of this issue. So you see these chance encounters, just God moving things along. One of the other things, I think I listened to this over the last couple of weeks, but the unnamed servant in chapter 2, who was the one who technically introduces Boaz to Ruth. Everybody wants to attribute that to Naomi as being the matchmaker, but technically it was the servant who introduces them, because Boaz comes to the field and says, who's that lady over there? Who's she with? And it's the servant in chapter 2 that says, well, that's the Moabite woman who's the daughter-in-law of Naomi, and he tells her about all the good things that she's done for that family. And one of the preachers or teachers that I read or listened to this last couple of weeks said that the unnamed servant is kind of I didn't get to check this out in the rest of the Old Testament, so take this for what it's worth, but kind of likened an unnamed servant in the Bible, in the Old Testament specifically, to being the Holy Spirit. Kind of the silent witness who's just kind of going and moving things along in the right direction according to the will of God. And I thought that was an interesting point. Like I said, I didn't get to check it out, but it's worth mentioning here. In chapter 3, you've got Naomi, probably, and we'll talk about this next Sunday, but concocting this plan that's probably not the best one in the world, but we'll talk about that in more detail when we get there, about her, how to get she's trying to teach Ruth how to get Boaz's attention to ultimately where they can get married. It's probably not the most well-concocted plan, but God still uses it, right? So even though it's probably not or is a questionable human decision, God still is able to work it out for good. And then the last chapter, God is still going to do everything by the book, right? You've kind of got the legal proceedings that are played out, and the transfer of ownership and the redeeming of Ruth and Naomi. You see how God is even playing into the legal proceedings of the day to make sure that his purposes are ultimately fulfilled. And then we talked about this at the start of our lesson, but the contrast of the people overall that we studied in the book of Judges versus the people and the characters that we study in the book of Ruth are night and day. I mean, they're totally two different types of people. They're all Israelites. They're all supposed to be servants and children of God, but they act totally differently. Not once in the entire book of Ruth, even though bad things happen, there's this. It starts off with all the men of this one family dying. So you've got this problem that seems to have a solution when they go back to Bethlehem and they meet Boaz, but then, oh wait, another problem. You've got this other redeemer who happens to be in the line ahead of Boaz. So, okay, well, how are we going to get out of this one? Even though these dire and seemingly bad things seems to happen to this family, there's not one instance of anyone demanding that God step in and do something about it. When we look back in Judges, you'd have the people crying out to God, deliver us. Even I think it was in chapter 10 where they say, or where God says, no, I'm not going to step in and deliver you this time. I've seen this story play out before, and you guys just turn right back around. They say, well, yeah, we won't do that anymore. That past is past. Just save us right now. Just take care of us today, or take care of us right now. So these people kind of demanding and trying to manipulate God and get him to do what they want him to do. But not once do you see the people cry out to God to relieve them of their own distress. Instead, you see people offering up these prayers to God, or actually calling down blessings from God on other people because they have a genuine care for them. There's this desire for the best interests of other people. and you've got this, we won't list or we won't speak to each of these, but time and time again, you've got people calling on God to list off these, or to bestow these blessings on the people for their own benefit, right? For their own best interest, instead of myself. And then because of that, God acts, right? When people are working in the best interest of other people, God does something about it and to help that move along and to be a favorable outcome for all involved. God acts positively with all of this, instead of him acting negatively back in the period of the judges, having to bring oppressors to try to prod Israel in the right direction. Again, kind of in that genuine care for others, like we've talked about this with Boaz, but his continual giving, not only with the way he seems to treat his workers in chapter 2, but when he meets Ruth, he gives her gifts and gives her extra food and says to his other workers, leave her alone and make sure when you guys are even doing your jobs that you, instead of kind of going out of your way like we talked about to make sure you get all the corners of my field, make it even worse. Do worse at your jobs. Leave more laying around so that she has more to pick up for herself. And you see how he ultimately takes compassion and care on her by saying, okay, because you have acted this way, I'll do everything I can to try to redeem you. And so you've kind of got the greatness of multiple good, honorable people they're kind of referred to, working together to multiply exceeding blessings. Both characters, both Boaz and Ruth, are referred to as honorable or upstanding characters. Right? Boaz was an honorable man, and Boaz calls Ruth an honorable woman. It's the same word that was used back, I think it was in chapter 20, when referring to the Benjamites as being noble warriors. Remember those left-handed Benjamites who could sling their stones and at a hair and not miss? They were honorable warriors. So again, I think you're kind of seeing a contrast to our story in Judges. Those Benjamites were honorable, good warriors, but Boaz and Ruth are honorable people. Right, they're good and upstanding, the best of the best from a people perspective. And so you've got Boaz's excessive giving and Ruth's excessive hard working, ultimately working out to everyone's best interest when you put those things together. But despite these people being as good as they are, and Ruth being as good as she is, and as hard of a worker as she is, and having this care and compassion on her mother-in-law, she's still in need of a redeemer, right? She's still a widow in a foreign land who can't make it on her own. Now, she's a hard worker and she gives it everything she's got, but that's not enough. Not enough in the culture, not enough in the day. She still needs someone to step in on her behalf to ultimately redeem her. And if Ruth, or if Boaz is a Christ-like figure in the story of Ruth, then we, especially as Gentiles, are Ruth. Right? We are represented in the story by Ruth. We need someone to step in on our behalf to take charge of the situation and ultimately be our Redeemer as well. The story of Ruth is, you can kind of liken it to a mini gospel, if you will, right? That, you've got the Israelites being rejected, Ruth kind of being grafted in, Ruth listening to the message that her mother-in-law preaches, and then crying on Boaz for the Christ-like figure for deliverance. Bring me under your wing, let me take refuge with you. So she calls on the Redeemer to save her. So it's a very poignant way to look at the story of Ruth and how it plays into our lives as Christians today. And we'll stop there, I guess. But we'll pick up on Wednesday with chapter 1 specifically. Thank you all.